Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Webinar Wednesday by Smartkarma. I'm Michael Tegos. Today, I'm very excited to welcome back to the webinar Campbell Gunn, who will discuss how Japan's new Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, will impact the market based on his policy priorities. Campbell wrote an extensive Smartkarma original insight on the topic, which I definitely encourage that you follow along with. He will elaborate on some points from the insight, but the entire thing is definitely worth your time. A few quick words about Campbell. He is a former Japan equity PM with over 30 years of experience, and he's now providing database-driven analysis of the Japanese market, sectors, peer groups, and stocks for Lightstream research. Before we get to our presentation, a few housekeeping notes. Do remember that you can always send questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and we will address them at the Q&A section afterwards. Please do not reshare or reproduce the contents of this webinar without permission. We will have a recording in the Insight page afterwards, as always. And with that, Campbell, let me welcome you. Thank you very much for being with us today. And please start at your convenience.
Thank you very much. And welcome to those that are listening. I have Marilyn Monroe over my shoulders. It's a long explanation as to why she's there, which won't get into right now. Mr. Suga is a very interesting character, and I didn't produce a slideshow for this, but I would like anyone who's listening to refer to the note that I wrote, the Smartkarma original, and the slides that are embedded in that. The first one being the history of Japanese prime ministerial tenures going back to 1979, and how the markets, principally topics and the Japanese yen, have reacted and evolved under these various conditions. As you can see, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is in light green, has provided most of the governments of Japan over this period. There are two exceptions to that. The dark blue period, when we had coalition government with the socialists, and then the period of the opposition DPJ, which had to go through 3 different prime ministers before they were finally booted out. The key to this is that Japan has had, rather like Italy, a succession of prime ministers over the years. There have been 99 since 1885. Suga is the 99th. But the markets prefer extended periods of LDP government. And in this period of 50 years, we've actually had 3 of those, first being Nakasone, then Koizumi, and the second Abe premiership. The question is, will Mr. Suga have a similar experience, and therefore will markets respond accordingly? There is, however, the other argument that Suga is actually a continuation of Abe, and therefore this could be the longest continual period of single administration in modern Japanese history. I would consider that to be a bullish factor. So Suga is certainly, as we'll come on to the reasons why, more of the same of Abe, of the Abe administration, because effectively he was the backroom fixer in the form of the chief cabinet secretary for all of Abe's second premiership. However, I also believe that he intends to have a very different approach, has different priorities, which are particularly pertinent to Japan's current economic and social situation. And therefore, I think we will have a different tack and an attempt to address a lot of Japan's domestic issues, which Abe was less inclined to do. Much more, Abe was much more interested in Japan's foreign policy and also his quixotic endeavor to change the constitution. Again, we will get into that. Suga is quite a different character, and in Japan there's a tradition that political dynasties are established and seats in the Diet, the Japanese parliament, are passed from father to son, or in certain cases, father to daughter. And therefore, the elites that run the LDP effectively prevent ambitious young men from the provinces, which is definitely Mr. Suga, from gaining power. The only exception in recent, and when I say recent, in my lifetime, Japanese history was Tanaka Kakue, who was from Niigata and was a bruiser in every sense of the word. He was felled by the Lockheed corruption scandal, and certainly his control over the Japanese political system was based on coercion, monetary favors, bribery, and corruption, none of which apply to Suga. Suga's statement that he made on the 16th of September, which is the first quote in bolded quote in the presentation, gives an indication as to what he thinks are the priorities for Japan, and that he intends to govern for the people. And given that he is certainly a man of the people, this certainly has resonance. One thing I didn't put in to the presentation, because it's slightly pejorative, is that Suga's hero is a figure from Japan's distant past, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who succeeded the great unifier of Japan in the Middle Ages, Oda Nobunaga, and had a peasant background. He ruled very effectively, but also extremely brutally. And his nickname, because he was short and ugly, was Kozaru, which means little monkey in Japanese. I didn't put this into the document, but Suga is referred to as Kozaru by a lot of his opponents in the LDP, but certainly it is a compliment to be compared to Toyotomi, given that he certainly was one of Japan's key leaders of the past. And I think Suga, given where he comes from and how he got to his current position, would feel that if he can change Japan as much as Toyotomi did, he would have succeeded in his mission. So his background is unusual, as I mentioned. He is from a northern province where the current situation is one of massive depopulation. He's from a farming family, but he didn't want to succeed his father in growing strawberries, and he effectively ran away from home without any prospects. He did, however, when he was working in a factory, decide that politics was what he wanted to achieve as a career goal, but knew that he needed a university education to do that. So he financed his own way through a law school. Hosei University was originally founded as a law school, and he did graduate from that school with an LLB, and did not, as was very fashionable at the time, become involved in any radical student uprisings. This was the period when Tokyo University was occupied, rather like the Soissons Huit in France in 1968. He was very much the diligent student, and if anything, rather dull and boring. But he tenaciously worked his way to a position in the office of a fairly powerful politician called Okanogi, who represented the Yokohama, one of the Yokohama districts. Now, Yokohama is actually Japan's second largest city. It's right next door to Tokyo. It's in Kanagawa Prefecture. And for him, this has become his power base, because he worked his way up through the office of Okinogi, initially as the 7th ranked secretary. He eventually ran the office, and then decided that he had enough experience to leave and join the local assembly in Yokohama. He famously cold called many houses in the area. He got on a soapbox and made speeches at the stations, and was pioneer in doing this, because he was an outsider. And in Japan, coming from outside the district makes it very, very difficult to become elected. He served as Jews in the local assembly for 8 years, and then stood for the Diet, and was successfully elected on the first occasion, which again is very unusual, by his direct appeal to voters. He now effectively controls all the politics in Kanagawa Prefecture, now obviously as well in Japan, but this is his power base, and it's unusual to have such a strong local power base without being part of a faction. His career in the LDP was quite unusual. In the early days, he backed a losing candidate for the premiership, who was not his faction leader. He along with that candidate who's now deceased, Kajiyama-san, were both expelled from the faction, and Suga never ever really joined another faction. These factions are how people advance within the LDP as the cabinet positions are doled out amongst the factions once a prime minister is decided, and the prime minister's election is very much a cabal of various factions agreeing who should move forward. During the Koizumi administration, he was brought in from the cold, and Koizumi was a maverick who managed to become elected by not necessarily abusing, but by using the rules of the LDP's election system to his own advantage. He was an outsider from the mainstream, and he picked Suga out of obscurity and gave him a ministerial position. And one thing that Suga is very good at is attaching himself to people that he thinks will help his career and will gain positions of significant power. And he was very early in identifying the possibilities for former Prime Minister Abe. Now, obviously, Abe, being the grandson of a prime minister and the son of a former foreign minister, is about as blue-blooded as you can get in Japanese politics. Nevertheless, he wasn't the favorite to become prime minister or leader of the party to begin with, and then prime minister. But he was backed to the hilt by Suga. And in return, when Abe became prime minister, he was given a cabinet rank in the ministry that he ran, but was cast aside as Abe ran into trouble. Now, during this period of effective opposition, because we had a DPJ government, we had an escalation of disputes with China and North Korea. We had the 3/11 double disasters of the earthquake and tsunami, all of which the DPJ handled with no skill whatsoever. And therefore, the swing to the LDP was fairly natural. But during this period, he wrote what became a political manifesto, which he has since republished with a few amendments, interesting ones about. He's removed freedom of the press, which is we'll get on to. But his statement in this, which I'll read out, is really the key to understanding Suga's political philosophy. True political leadership is the maximization of the national interest while mastering the bureaucracy while heeding the voice of the people. He has done all three throughout his political career and will continue to do so as prime minister. And so certainly the national interest comes first. He is not as overtly right-wing as Abe, and he does not have the goal that Abe had of rewriting Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution to allow first strike capability in the event of Japan coming under threat militarily. However, he will defend Japan's interests to the hilt, and we'll cover his relations with Korea and China in a minute. He is the master of the bureaucracy of Japan. He recast the appointment of all of the major senior civil service positions by setting up the Cabinet Personnel Bureau, and has for the last 7 years controlled almost all of the major appointments, and therefore these people owe Suga their roles. Now, this obviously can be abused and has been abused during the Abe administration to cover up embarrassing documents, destroy documents. And so there's a dark side to Suga, which I don't think will go away and has already caused him some issues as prime minister. After Abe had to leave government first time because of illness, he vowed that he would restore Abe absolutely. And this was actually against the wishes of Abe's family, who did not wish to see a repeat of his ill health, although we've now obviously subsequently had that. And certainly also it wasn't the consensus within the LDP. But no other politician could have given Suga the power that he achieved under Abe as chief cabinet secretary. Abe's goals, and I'm not going to refer necessarily to the 3 arrows because only one of them really was fired, which was the quantitative easing and the weak yen policy, which did help restore economic growth, although China's economic revival also played a major part in that. Abe's goal of raising Japan's global profile didn't really help improve relations with China or the two Koreas. Abe's main success was to play Trump successfully, to avoid any tariffs imposed on the Japanese auto industry, and to delay any increase in the contribution that Japan makes for the presence of US military on Japanese soil. Abe also, as I mentioned, failed to revise the constitution. Apart from these areas of success, modest improvement and failure, Suga pretty much did everything else in terms of running domestic policy in Japan. And a lot of the major initiatives, such as the idea that you could pay tax and get presents from local businesses in proportion to how much you effectively hypothecate to the local regions, was his idea. Whether you think it's sensible or not is another matter. But he also, more importantly, was behind the foreign worker visa program, which is a way of Japan addressing both its shortage of unskilled labor force and avoiding immigration. Now, this program has been widely abused by Japanese companies and isn't really, couldn't really be qualified as a wholesale success, but the numbers are impressive. His other more recent initiative has been to complain about the excessive fees that are being charged by the mobile phone companies, something we'll get onto later on. And it's clear that during the time that Suga was chief cabinet secretary, that information flow to journalists and the Japan's ranking in the world press freedom went from 22 to 66. And a lot of this was due to Suga's attitude towards journalistic investigation, particularly one very aggressive, in his eyes, a reporter on the Tokyo Shimbun, who also happens to be a lady, and who he effectively cut out of his daily press briefings. Now, I don't think Abe wanted Suga necessarily to succeed him, but Abe had not groomed any successor, and those that he had attempted to promote were pretty dreadful and had to and effectively faded away through a series of inept gaffes, or just not being up to even the jobs, lower level jobs in the cabinet that they were supposed to do. And therefore, by default, and because of the circumstances under which Abe retired, Suga was the only logical choice, without the LDP going through a period of fractious debate. The only other possible candidate was the defense minister, Kono, and he's been co-opted, as we'll see, to champion administrative reform. In any case, given Japan's age structure, Suga's 71, it's too early for this second generation. And so Suga has effectively a pass until the next re-election of the president of the LDP, and if the LDP are a government, therefore that person becomes prime minister, which happens in September next year. And then within 2 years, there needs to be another general election. So he has about a year to prove himself, and therefore he has been fairly clear that he will hit the ground running with a lot of policy initiatives. On his personal matters, he has a degree of he's a bit of a fanatic in a number of senses. He doesn't drink. He has a fairly rigid physical fitness routine. He lives above the shop. Although his wife lives in Yokohama, he moved in to a dormitory next to the Kante, the prime minister's residence, and has lived there since 2013, and that's continuing. He reads extremely widely, is very intelligent, and is a furious networker. There's probably no senior figure in the business world or in academia that he has not courted or knows. He very often has more than one dinner in the evening. Obviously, if you don't drink, that's easier to do. On the other side, he is unforgiving, he is brutal, and he is resolute. All of these are Toyotomi characteristics. Examples of this is that he probably needlessly, but did anyway, picked a fight over appointment of several academics to the Science Council of Japan. These academics had protested and had refused a government program which would have allowed the Defense Ministry to use the science departments of various universities to conduct defense science projects. This has become a very public fight, and he has been obdurate in ignoring and giving very vague explanations as to why he did this. It's clear to everyone that this is a quid pro quo for the previous opposition, but it hasn't helped his public image. He's also refused to visit South Korea until there is a overruling of the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling that Japanese companies' assets could be seized as compensation for wartime labor recruitment of South Korean nationals. He did, however, and again, this reveals his practical side, just meet with the South Korean spy chief in the last week. And so, again, he's not obdurate, but he will defend his position to the hilt in public. Another example, during the initial phase of COVID, the coalition Kome party, who have a very broad base in the Kanto area from middle and working class supporters, this is a lay Buddhist organization, they were adamant that everyone in Japan should be given 100,000 yen as compensation for loss of income. Abe was reluctant. The Komeito threatened to walk from the coalition. Suga smoothed the waters, and the payment went ahead. So he is definitely a fixer in the broadest sense. My view is that he will also want to make his mark, and that although a lot of Abe's policies will continue, particularly in the economic and foreign policy areas, he will also try and make his own mark with a view to being re-elected as LDP president, and then facing the electorate and winning an overwhelming majority, and certainly higher than Abe's majority at the next general election. So I'm going to go through briefly each of the policy areas and then wrap up with the stock ideas that we have. The defense situation is unlikely to change even if Biden is president. In fact, Biden will probably give Japan an easier ride than Trump as regards the contribution to the cost of supporting US forces here. Japan is very much under the US defense and foreign policy umbrella. Most of Tokyo airspace is controlled by the US military. There are very large bases of all of the arms of the US military here. However, Japan will commit to increasing defense expenditure. It's already above NATO levels, although obviously Japan is not a member of that. And there will be a renewed focus on cybersecurity and a new focus on space security. Again, pretty much towing the US line. I don't think that he will be confrontational with China and South Korea, but he's not going to engage. Interestingly, his first overseas trips were to ASEAN, Indonesia and Vietnam, and the concept of an Asian version of NATO, I think, is very much within his. He would support this. That would include also India and Australia and New Zealand, and there have been recent joint naval exercises with the Australian and US Navy. So, all in all, I think it's a continuation, but I wouldn't expect any improvements in relations. And whatever goes on with China will really key off whatever US policy towards China evolves to be. Economically, again, we will have more of the same. The Bank of Japan has continued its quantitative easing and purchase of ETFs. However, I think it's clear that Japan is moving from the previous, what I call development model, which South Korea and China are still in, which is maximizing production of all material, of all forms of materials. And I think Abe wanted to revive that model and did so successfully, primarily by weakening the yen. However, and certainly the profitability of Japanese companies improved dramatically. However, I think Japan is now moving towards what I call a financial surplus model. This means that Japanese corporates will be much more focused on profitability, will hoard cash, and to mollify foreign investors will certainly increase dividends and share buybacks. And certainly, as you can see, there's a chart in the presentation about how Japan has only in the last 10 years become a net corporate cash economy. There's a certain amount of mythology about how long Japanese companies have had piles of cash. It's only been excessive, in my view, in the last 3 years as a result of the Abe boom. Now that they have large piles of cash, they feel very comfortable and secure. And COVID has given Japanese companies an excuse to cut costs on a fairly dramatic basis. This is why the profitability of larger Japanese companies has been rapidly recovering, as we've seen in the results that are coming out at the moment for the half year for most companies. This, however, doesn't help households, and it doesn't help smaller companies who are reliant on the larger companies for their income and revenue. And therefore, households have also started to raise cash. They've been given some money by the government, but they are currently hoarding this cash as well. This means that eventually, I believe that Japan will be raising taxes. We'll get onto that in a minute. Most Japanese people are now resigned to the fact that Japan is a fading economic power. They have decided that they do not want higher levels of debt with the model that China pursues, nor do they wish to have large levels of immigration. And the repeated terrorist incidents, which can be attributed to immigrant communities in many parts of Europe, ignoring the religious aspect, have solidified Japan's view that immigration should continue to be highly limited. This means that the average Japanese person is happy, but doesn't expect the economy or their income to grow substantially. There is a concern, obviously, about what the pension situation will be, and hence my view that the tax take will have to rise. But Japan's misery index, unemployment plus inflation, is at a 50-year low. And I think while it isn't necessarily great that the youth of Japan has kind of given up on being part of the global community and is resigned to being a salaried employee for most of their life, that this seems to be acceptable. And therefore, Japan is going to be a financial surplus country. It's going to save more, it's going to spend less. And those companies that are at the top of the pile will focus on profitability more than scale. And so this is what this leads to is a two-tier market where you have very successful companies, as you do in certain sectors of the US, which are trading on extreme valuations because of their growth, and a lot of moribund companies in older analog industries with extremely attractive, from a traditional value perspective, valuations. And I would include most of small cap Japan in the latter category. And so this market is evolving pretty much like the US. And whether that makes it attractive as a market relative to the US is mainly because of the second category. And therefore, what people buy when the index goes up tends to be rather similar in the US, extremely expensive, high quality growth stocks. So there are interesting parallels here. So I do think that the tax rates have to go up. Japan's tax take of GDP is well below the European average, and is more appropriate for a high growth, high population growth economy. And therefore, I would expect once Suga is re-elected, i.e. we go through another election cycle, that the consumption tax will go up to 15% by 2027. It won't be popular, but it's going to be very necessary in order to fund Japan's healthcare and social spending budgets. Part of this, the offset for higher rates of taxation, would be a more efficient and less costly bureaucratic system. Japan actually doesn't have that many bureaucrats. Ironically, they are efficient. Certainly, the number compared to France as a percentage of population is very embarrassing for France. But Japan is still very much paper-driven society. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to do anything here, but personal seals are still used for almost all documentation. And one of the issues during the COVID, initial phase of COVID here, was that staff had to go to the office just to put a seal on the document and then go home. And so this seal and paper culture has been an early focus of administrative reform. I mean, enigmatic of the fact that Japan is a paper-bound country, the topics index still has a sub-index just for paper and pulp companies. Rather amusing, and it doesn't have one for internet companies. So Kono, who was previously foreign minister and then defense minister, and is probably an aspiring successor, has been given the task of doing this. He's the right person to appoint for this position. He's passionate techie. He did go to Georgetown, so his English is excellent. He is very good at communicating with the public. However, he has to work with and convince the bureaucracy. And although Suga has appointed many of the senior bureaucrats, they're not going to be a pushover. And so I think this will take time, and the focus will primarily be in the administration of healthcare, where at the moment there is no national documentation system. And I think certainly there are clear opportunities for many companies in this area. He will set up a digital agency, but that will take time because it requires an act of parliament to do so. And therefore, any major spending on this area is for probably his second term once he's re-elected. So this is a 2022 and onwards project, the digitalization. While all of this talk has been going on, if you take the number of listed internet and information technology stocks, and I'm excluding the telco sector from this, Japan already has 500 listed companies in this area. And it's the largest segment of any, if you put the two together, it's the largest single segment. Ironically, the largest single one is still wholesale, which is again a reflection of the inefficiencies that still exist in this country. And I did write another Smartkarma original quite some time ago, reviewing the internet sector and highlighting the fact that Japan has really lagged the US in developing local champions in this area, despite the fact that in the year 2000, these sectors combined accounted for a larger portion of the market in terms of percentage than they do today. Many of these companies failed to capitalize on their early mover advantage. Obviously, it takes a while for anyone coming into this market to localize, given the language barriers. However, I think the US companies were extremely adept at doing this. And as a result, the major internet and the major IT companies in Japan are all American. And I don't think that will change. And NEC was the last bastion. They had their own chips, they had their own operating system, which was still in use when I first came here. Nowadays, everything is Wintel or Apple. Japan also focused heavily on mainframes and completely missed the distributed server network model. And therefore, when the internet came along, Japan was ripe for the picking. And unlike China, because of Japan's security dependence on the US, there was nothing that Japan could do about in order to limit the growth of US internet companies here. So Amazon here is as rampant as it is in the US, and the service is even better than, in my view, than in the US. So the area that Suga has focused on, as I mentioned, in terms of helping the cost of living in Japan is telecommunication services. Now, I have a chart in the presentation which shows you that, or in the insight, that from 2004 to 2015, the aggregate profitability of Japanese mobile phone and fixed line phone companies did not change. And therefore, the provision of voice was really not a profitable enterprise. However, in the last 5 years, profits have gone up by more than 50%, and all of that is attributed to priced data plans, where we've had clearly a data explosion, and the usage of mobile phones while commuting, and therefore the playing of games and other phenomenon here is something to behold if you're ever traveling at that time of morning. Clearly, the mobile phone bill is the largest, is the third largest after rent and food for any Japanese household. And to cut this by maybe 10,000 yen a year would be symbolic, and certainly driven a number of recent changes in the sector. The first was obviously because of NTT's status as still effectively a government-owned entity. They were the first to respond by cutting their price plans. And there's a chart here which shows you the bottoming of this relative share price at the point the price plans were announced. And since Suga was prime minister, within a very short space of time, NTT decided to buy out the minorities of NTT Docomo. SoftBank is a different kettle of fish because of its other businesses. But I would say that the other issue, and I pointed to this in the note, was the ownership of KDDI. And since I wrote this, Toyota has increased its stake in KDDI. I would expect that to continue to increase and eventually for Toyota to buy out Kyocera's stake and eventually buy the whole of KDDI, giving Toyota a new business arm. Rakuten is the spoiler here, given that they are willing to lose money for quite a few years in order to establish a low cost and low price alternative service. But clearly, this sector is the most traded sector in the market and will continue to provide a sensible amount of volatility for anyone who is able to see what's going to happen next. Overall, however, if you exclude SoftBank, I don't think the profitability in the sector will go up, and it will certainly not reach the 3 trillion yen operating income level for some time, if ever again. If you don't have immigration, you've got to have more babies. And clearly, the government's policy, while I think it's not necessarily going to change Japan's birth rate significantly, is helpful for those people that do have problems reproducing. And certainly his focus and mention of the free provision of fertility treatment under the National Health Insurance Scheme was very popular with people in this circumstance, and certainly it was a vote winner with women who were completely ignored despite the rhetoric by the Abe administration. So I think, again, it's a very smart thing to do. I don't think it will necessarily help them reach the target, which is 1.8, and that would be higher than the United States and Ireland and Brazil, but it's a move in the right direction. Now, another area where we've had quite a lot of action in the last few days is regional revitalization and regional banks. Since becoming Prime Minister, the other area of policy pronouncement that has market implications was that Suga mentioned that there are too many regional banks in Japan. Now, historically, there were, by effective government mandate, 2 regional banks in every one of the 43 non-urban prefectures in Japan. Japan has other, there are 47 prefectures, but some of them are actually cities. So it meant that you had enough of a sector that my good friend Brian Waterhouse was able to make a career out of analyzing them, and still does on Smartkarma platform. Clearly, with the regional economies in decline, these banks are not viable. And they've come up with a variety of wheezes to continue to pretend that they are still viable entities. Brian put up a comment on Smartkarma a few hours ago in response to a piece written by Daniel Tabush, which I recommend that you read on this. And I quote effectively the same sentence in this note, which is that merging banks isn't really the answer. However, the maverick president of SBI Holdings, Kitao-san, has decided that he's going to take this opportunity to create a regional bank network, which he will use to challenge the 3 main banks, 3 main so-called city banks in Japan. Kitao has certainly got the ear of the Prime Minister, and that's probably where this comment about too many regional banks comes from. However, Brian, and I share this, is not that optimistic about the investment opportunities that will prevail from the sector, but certainly there are a lot of stale foreign owners of these stocks, and they have done, they've invested in these entities with this reorganization in mind, but it's unclear that this is a strategy that will make significant amounts of relative performance. Certainly there is an idea of establishing, in addition to these measures to encourage regional banks to merge, and there was a policy announcement from the Bank of Japan, which is what started the discussion between Daniel and Brian, to establish some form of special enterprise zone, which is related to finance. There have been attempts over the last 30 years to have some forms of special enterprise zones in Japan. However, they've been not orientated towards foreign capital. And in the most recent case, they were actually abused by Abe on behalf of one of his friends. That was a dental school when Japan doesn't need another dental school. So Kitao is again supporting the idea that there will be a proper international financial center. There are three candidates, obviously Tokyo, but it makes more sense to have one in Osaka or Fukuoka. Fukuoka is the home, well, it's not the hometown, but it's the home capital of the prefecture that Deputy Prime Minister Aso Taro comes from, and his elder brother, who went to the same college at Oxford that I did, and is a very nice chap, is leading that bit. I have severe doubts that this will entice any major financial institution to move from Hong Kong. The obvious place to go other than Hong Kong would be Singapore. And one of the two main areas that I have that count against Japan in this are the opacity of the legal system. It's a Napoleonic legal system and not a common law English system, which applies to some extent now in Hong Kong and to a greater extent in Singapore. And also the lack of international schooling and the language barrier. So they will set it up. It probably won't work. Won't be a great success. But again, it's an emphasis on a policy that will be implemented rather than just talked about. So I think Suga is a guy that gets things done. Abe was quite content to talk big, you know, all hat and no cattle stuff. This then leads on to a need to restructure small and medium-sized enterprises. There are a large number of very old leaders of Japanese companies who don't have a natural successor within the family or necessarily within the business. And so clearly there has been a boom in M&A, domestic M&A, and the leading stock in this area is highlighted in the insight. It certainly and will be a necessary move to support these companies that are suffering primarily because of cost cutting at the large company level. And so there is a lot of work that needs to be done in revitalizing the regions and in providing succession opportunities for these SMEs. Japan is not alone in this problem. It applies in Germany, the UK, and many other countries in Europe. There's no necessarily sensible solution, and particularly when a lot of these businesses are analog. I mean, Japan excels in high precision, small bits and pieces. Good example of a company that succeeded in transitioning to the digital world is Murata. Nidec is another example, but all of these are bits that go into other bits that go into end products usually sold by, made in China and sold by American companies. But there's a whole raft of a supply chain that feeds up into these companies, and Japan's future as a manufacturing base is clearly under threat from this attrition of the leadership of many of these small enterprises. The last area where we've have a change is in a potential for change is in electric power, where Suga has mentioned that Japan will be carbon neutral by 2050. That is an ambitious goal and would require a revitalization of the nuclear power industry in Japan. I'm conscious that we're nearly at the hour mark and there may be some questions. I've added in with certain trepidation some ideas of long-term shorts and longs at the end. These are much more thematic than necessarily stock recommendations as we speak, although one or two of them have been doing relatively well in the last week or so, following the possibility of a COVID vaccine. So I'm going to conclude there and hand back to Michael and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive account, Campbell. In fact, you actually addressed a lot of the questions I had, but I'm very mindful of the time, so I think I'll keep it to one key question, which is, you gave a very comprehensive account of the situation, as I said, but how stable is it? Do you think, in your view, what are Mr. Suga's chances of re-election should there be another election, or what are the chances even of a snap election?
I don't think he wants a snap election because of COVID. It doesn't make sense because voting is in person in Japan. Although there are postal votes, everyone tends to vote locally. And also, he needs time to prove himself in terms of policies, and also for people to forget some of his early missteps. I think the chances of him being re-elected as LDP president are very high. And I think the chances of him being elected as the LDP winning the next election are very high. And therefore, he will have, in my view, 5 years to implement these policies. And that's why I mean, and generally speaking, I'm bullish on Japan. There are lots of overbought stocks here. And therefore, if you want to be bullish on Japan, you're going to have to look at some of the more troubled areas where there will be a resurgence and reform. And that's how the market will get. I mean, everyone was talking about the Nikkei getting to a long-term new high, but what that means is that nothing has changed for the last 30 years. We do need to see not just the Nikkei breakout, but more importantly, the topics. And the topics high post the bubble is 1911, and we're still just at 1700. So there's a lot of room on the upside. That can only be filled with a resurgence in the more value-orientated sectors of the market.
Right. What do you think is going to happen with the Olympics? Do you think that, of course, assuming that they happen this year as rescheduled, do you think that there's sufficient groundwork done by the Abe administration that Suga will continue, or do you think that there will be a different approach?
That's up to the IOC. Japan will do whatever the IOC decides. Now, clearly, the infrastructure is all in place. They're ready to go. And they have to obviously compensate many of the providers. The sponsors also have a major role, and many of those are Japanese companies. They do want it to go ahead because they've committed so much in terms of sponsorship money. It will require a COVID vaccine before the IOC can make a decision.
Well, fingers crossed for that. I think with that, we're just at the hour mark. So, Campbell, I want to thank you very much for your account once again. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And please do refer to Campbell's insight on the platform, as well as the additional insights that Campbell has mentioned. They provide a lot of very useful context for the presentation today. If you have any other questions, please email us at research@smartkarma.com. And please do feel free to contact your Smartkarma account manager if you want to engage Campbell directly. With that, thank you, Campbell, once again, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you very much.